Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. We are continuing on. In fact, we're finishing SPQR by Mary Beard today. There's 1 week left in April, and I think for our next time I will do something like what I did last time. I will do sort of supplementary reading. Mary Beard includes a lot of supplementary reading at the end of this book, but I thought I would do the same thing, mention a few books, talk about a few things like that. But where we left off last week was a genuinely pivotal moment, the essential transformation of Rome, despite what the Roman historian Tacitus might have teased people with, into the possession of one man, a complete autocracy, and that man was Augustus, the man who took on the name Augustus, and after Augustus, there was only a succession of other absolute rulers, Eastern-style absolute rulers, people who could look at someone they don't like and say to an omnipresent armed guard, kill him. And it would not be a question of laws and a trial and the judiciary. It would simply be that the soldier would walk over and kill that person. And that the Senate, that still retained the outward trappings of a representative body of the people, would applaud, or they would be next. That's a fundamental change. Now, Romans were able to live, if you were 21 years old, when Octavian became Augustus, became first among equals, became the first citizen. If you were 21 years old, then you could probably have lived the rest of your life in the comfortable illusion that that change had not happened. You could probably have lived to old age, which would have been 60 if you were lucky, 60, 65, until a tooth abscessed, or until, you had a heart attack or something like that, and died because there was no medicine. You could probably have lived until that time thinking that the Senate did have power, that this was not an autocracy, that I am not, in fact, you could have said in your apartment over a bakery, or in your modest villa just outside of the walls of Rome, that you pay for by owning an apartment complex inside Rome. You could have said on your deathbed, I'm not a slave. I'm a free person. You would have been wrong, but you could have said that. I think you would have been able to believe that for quite some time afterwards. And that's where we stopped last time. And what we're doing now, at least the first part of the chapters that we're reading today, is Mary Beard examining a world in which that illusion was gone, in which the army was picking rulers over people, and those rulers had absolute power because of the army. So we get, at the beginning of the chapters that we're reading today, a succession of emperors. And Mary Beard goes through them fairly quickly. She seems to be interested in them, but I think she recognizes that that is extremely well-trod ground, extremely familiar territory. And this book has, I'm more appreciative than ever. I'm more appreciative than ever now that we're doing this for the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. I'm more appreciative than ever of the fact that this book is at heart not as predictable as other histories of Rome. It can't help but, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, it can't help but go where the sources are. It's not like if you want to tell an unconventional history of Rome, you can devote 3 chapters at the end to the Emperor Trajan, for instance. Because unless you're willing to get down in the weeds with epigraphical studies, there isn't enough information. There were all sorts of histories that were written of Trajan's reign. We don't have any of them. Trajan himself had an autobiography ghostwritten that was long and extensive. We have one line from it. That's all. We don't have any of the rest of it. It's gone. All of his courtiers wrote books. He encouraged it. And those books are all gone. They don't survive. So even though Trajan was one of the most substantial Roman emperors who expanded the empire to its greatest geographical extent, and was the good old days, he was the good old days embodied. He was, in long later years, Romans would look back on him and say, those were the good old days. A sensible, non-tyrannical man. If the empire is going to be in the hands of one man, you have to hope it'll be a good man. For 1,000 years, the citizens of England knew the reality of that. And Trajan was a good man. He did exactly what emperors were supposed to do. He exercised a comparatively light hand over the populace, and he made war. 2 big wars. Gave the populace all sorts of new amenities, including a few bathhouses, and public bathhouses were a very important amenity and very appreciated by the people. Not still too high a price to pay for their freedom, but they weren't thinking of it that way. And also a very big library in one particular neighborhood and a gigantic library in another neighborhood, also a public good. And you would like to include 3 chapters about that. Certainly Roman, for instance, I don't even know, 100 years after Trajan, in the early 3rd century, a Roman looking back would have said, well, any history of Rome is going to have 3 chapters on Trajan alone, and you'd like to do that, but you can't. You don't have enough sources to do that. So you're going to go where the sources are, and some of the sources for that parade of emperors are fun, but almost hackneyed. They are resorted to so often, foremost being Suetonius. So instead, we get a chapter on the Roman emperors, and Mary Beard chooses, instead of going, from one tired character anecdote to the next, she decides to concentrate on the nature of that change. And she puts it really well in one spot that I marked here about these changes where the Praetorian Guard picks Claudius to be emperor, and Claudius maintains for years, in public anyway, that he was a reluctant emperor. And Mary Beard writes, it's very succinct, but it's very well done, very well put. These events are a vivid snapshot of the politics of Roman autocracy almost 30 years after the death of Augustus. The Senate's ineffective posturing over the restoration of the Republic serves only to prove that the old system of government was gone for good, little more than a nostalgic fantasy conjured up by those who had never experienced it. That's brutal, but that is absolutely true, and that forms the bulk of what's coming, of what is how we start off the 3 chapters that we're reading today, plus the epilogue. Then Mary Beard moves on to a kind of a chapter that is also very familiar in popular books about ancient Rome, which is basically a day in the life. There have been many books by that name, A Day in the Life of Ancient Rome, Life in the Ancient Roman, Life with the Ancient Romans, that sort of thing. They're always fascinating. We know enough information to make them fascinating, and we're learning more all the time about what a bar was like, about if you had a job, as a bookkeeper for a bricklaying firm, did you live in an apartment building in Rome, one of those aforementioned apartment buildings? And if you did, well, what was it like to live in an apartment building? And how did that life differ from floor to floor to floor? Mary Beard points out what many commentators have pointed out in the past, which is that the Roman apartment buildings were the inverse of our own apartment buildings, the ones that I see when I'm walking in downtown Boston all the time, where it's the very top that is the most luxurious. It's the top that you never see. It's the top that has luxuries that aren't even made public, so that you'd have to go up and see what it's like to even know, to have any sense of it. I've been in some of those apartments here and in New York City, and the people walking around on the ground who've only had, ordinary apartments don't have any idea how the other half lives. They really just don't. Those apartments are, of course, intensely vulnerable if anything went wrong, because you can't get air up there. You can't get environmental controls up there. You can't get food up there. If anything were to go wrong, as we've learned in many catastrophic building collapses, you'd be hard pressed up on those top. You wouldn't be able to get out, is what I'm trying to say, unless you had a helipad. But in Roman times, the best apartments were on the bottom. They were on the first floor. They were on the ground floor, behind heavy walls, behind heavy gates and protective matters. Those were the apartments that were the most expensive and the ones you wanted. And the higher up you went, the worse it got. Until finally you were living under the eaves, where, as one Roman poet put it, you could hear the pigeons cooing. And you weren't basically protected from the elements except the rain. It was freezing up there. It was boiling hot in summer. There was no water up there, no sanitation at all. If there was a fire in the building, as often happened, you were done for. There was no chance he would survive. So Mary Beard gives us that. She gives us what was it like to work, what was it like to eat, what was it like to go to a bar or a restaurant, what was it like to go to live in an apartment building, what was it like to experience the arts, what was your experience of the arts. She's very, very good at that. I don't think I'm the only person who was reading that chapter and thinking, what was that chapter called? I think it was called High and Low, the haves and the have-nots. I don't think I was the only person reading that chapter to kind of wish that she would do a whole book like that. But then again, I felt that way about a lot of this book. I wouldn't turn down a book with Mary Beard writing only about the mytho-history of Rome that we covered in the first meeting of the STD book club. I wouldn't turn down a book, her writing just about Cicero, or her updating, as Michael Grant did, the 12 Seizures of Suetonius. And her next book is about emperors. So, partially you get your wish. But in addition to that, the final chapter that we're reading outside of the sort of the summing up is about what life was like for the millions of people in the orbit of Rome, but not living in Rome. In the orbit both of the city and of the administrative state. What was that like? What was it like to live in the Roman provinces? And it's fascinating. And of course, when that subject comes up, one particular note you're going to have to talk about it, and that is Christianity. You're going to have to talk about Christianity when you're talking about this, because in very little time, comparatively speaking, the torch is going to be passed. The Christianity is going to become the animus of what was the Roman Empire at the time. And it's in the provinces that we get our earliest non-Roman, non-Jewish world reference to Christians, to what they're like in society. And that is in the letters of Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger was a man of letters, very much like Cicero in that regard, wrote all kinds of things, official speeches, bootlicking speeches for the Emperor Trajan, but also he was an official in Trajan's government and wrote all sorts of letters. He very much took Cicero as his model and wanted all of his correspondence published, and a lot of it was, a huge amount of it, including letters that he wrote back and forth with Trajan. That, it's unlikely that Trajan wrote the letters that bear his stamp. It was probably a palace functionary. But even so, it gives us an amazing inside view into what directives were coming from the Palatine Hill, what directives were coming from the imperial state. And Mary Beard gives us a bit about Christianity that I wanted to read you. It would probably have surprised both Pliny and Trajan to discover that 2,000 years later, the most famous of their exchanges is to do with an apparently insignificant but awkward and time-consuming new religious group, the Christians. Pliny admitted that he was not sure how to handle them. To start with, he had given them several opportunities to recant and executed only those who would not do so. A reminder that Christians were executed under Trajan. But then many more names were brought to his attention as people started to settle old scores by accusing their enemies of being Christian. Pliny continued to allow those under investigation to recant so long as they proved their sincerity by pouring wine and incense in front of the statue of the emperor and the true gods. But in order to find out what was at the bottom of all this, he had 2 Christian slave women tortured and questioned. In both the ancient Greece and Rome, slaves were allowed to give legal evidence only under torture, and concluded that Christianity was, quote, nothing other than a perverse and unruly superstition. He still wanted Trajan to confirm that this had been the right method of approach, and that is more or less what the emperor did, though he added a note of caution, quote, Christians should not be sought out, he wrote, but if they are accused and found guilty, they must be punished. This is the earliest surviving discussion of Christianity outside the Jewish and Christian literature. And it's a glimpse not only of what Christianity was like at the time, obviously widespread, but also what the imperial system was like when the man at the center of the imperial system was not a tyrannical monster, as we get glimpses of in these pages, both with Nero and Domitian, but also Caracalla, who is the emperor who gives the final note of this book by extending Roman citizenship to every free man in the empire. There's a wonderful note a lot of you have mentioned in the course of reading this book for the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club, that you really like the fact that Mary Beard is on the page with you. She's not just telling you this stuff in a really good narrative voice. She's also questioning it herself and wondering how much of it is true. And she spends a little bit of time talking about the horrible characters that have come down to us through history and whether or not they may be the result of codified propaganda from the succeeding generation. In other words, the eternal question, was Nero all that bad? but also everybody else. She doesn't spend as much time doing that with some other figures as I would like. And needless to say, the figure that I have most in mind is Tiberius. But she does do that with all of these negative figures, all of these figures that are portrayed so horribly. And she does it largely sitting in the situation, in the context of what Edward Gibbon described as the best run of emperors. The Spanish emperors and the Antonines that ruled for, with only a few exceptions, a rather long, comfortably long period each, and produced remarkable stability if you were that bookkeeper for a brick company in Rome. You knew that you were living in a relatively stable time. That was not going to last. That there were well-organized enemies who had been aping the Roman model for a century, and they had their eyes on the prize. They knew what they wanted. But that's not Mary Beard's story to tell, and she wraps up her account at the edge of those kinds of changes, very, very intentionally at the edge of the so-called decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And that brings our own book to an end, aside from her extensive further reading section, which I will delve into next time. So that's SPQR for the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. What I think more than ever was a really good, readable, opinionated, fair-minded whirlwind tour of Roman history. It doesn't feel a whirlwind when it's a big book, but I think a lot of you would understand. I think a lot of you probably feel the same way. And I'm wondering what you think, those of you who are at the end now with me. What do you think of the book? We'll talk about further readings next week in case this has sparked a real interest in you for Roman history. And I'll probably lay the groundwork a little for next month with the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club, which is Elizabeth Bishop, the great American poet, Elizabeth Bishop. But that's it for this month. Let me know what you think. I'm very happy for your company along for the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. We'll reconvene next week and talk about Rome one more time. So I'll see you then. Thank you.